to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Good. So welcome to this side event in the German Pavilion. My name is Celia and I work with BUND, that's Friends of the Earth Germany. And today we are co-hosting this event with our colleagues from German Watch and Stiftung Zukunftsfähigkeit. So I hope you all had a good start into the first week of COP yesterday. And since we're at the very beginning, we wanted to set the scene a bit, moving from the GST last year to the NDC updates next year. So this is a crucial middle point. And I'm so excited to have a great panel of speakers with me today who will be sharing the international civil society perspective, some regional inputs from the Eastern Europe, Caucasus, Central Asia region, and some colleagues from Southeast Asia. So there's two main questions we want to tackle today. The first one is, what is needed for the NDCs to deliver an increase in ambition, ensure implementation, and deliver on climate justice? And the second one, which is very closely linked to that, what is the role of civil society in this process, and how can their meaningful participation be ensured? So to start us off, one of our colleagues is actually going to join us. There he is already. He will give us an overview over the latest policy development, drawing a line from the Global Stocktake last year to the NDCs 3.0 next year. So I'm so glad to be joined by Peter Liden from German Watch today. He is the co-head of international climate policy, and he's been following the UN negotiations since 2004. So he knows what he's talking about. Also, he has advised the governments of Germany and Sweden in the past, and today he will talk about the NDC implications of the first Global Stocktake. Peter, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hello.
So we can't hear you yet. Oh. Can you say something again?
Yes, I'm speaking right now, but you can't hear it?
Okay.
I'll try again. Is it better now?
Yes, it's better now. So the stage is all yours, Peter.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Celia. And maybe first, just a couple of words as a co-organizer of this event. First of all, thank you to the German government for hosting us in their pavilion. And thank you to the panelists that I very much look forward to hearing in a little bit. I will just add a disclaimer that I had to jump in here on very short notice since my colleague, Lalit, who originally was organizing this event and who has also written the paper that I will be presenting, had on short notice to cancel his participation in COP and in this event. But with that said, I would like to take you through a preview of our upcoming paper, not yet out, on the NDC implications of the first Global Stocktake. I have a few slides that I will run you through. And of course, a few words on what the actual Global Stocktake is. The Paris Agreement, in its bottom-up approach, meaning that all countries contribute emissions reductions according to their own definitions in their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. That means that we need some way of making sure that they are ambitious enough. And the Global Stocktake is a key component in that mechanism that is there to make ambition rise over time under the Paris Agreement. The Global Stocktake itself assesses the progress that countries have been making towards the goals of the agreement. It identifies the gaps and the actions needed to fill them. The Global Stocktake happens every 5th year, according to the Paris Agreement. And that, of course, coincides with the NDC cycle, the whole ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement. And the Global Stocktake happens the 2 years that precede each new round of NDCs. And the Global Stocktake shall inform the new NDCs as part of the Paris Agreement. Then, as I think all of you know, we have just had the first global stocktake ever. What we're seeing now, what we're living now, is the first full cycle of the Paris Agreement. These are not the first new NDCs that we are seeing and will see, but it's the first set of new NDCs based on a global stocktake. And that's why it's extremely important that countries and we get this right, as this will be repeated in several cycles to come. So looking at that specific first global stocktake, what were the results, or what are the results? Well, not so surprising, but parties are not on track to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. If implemented, and that's a big if, the current national targets would only reduce emissions by 5% until 2030. The Global Stocktake says that a reduction of 43% is needed, but that was 1 year ago, and we haven't seen those improvements yet, meaning that's, if you take it from now on, that's rather around 50% actually. And those current plans, if they were to be implemented fully, they would lead to a temperature increase of somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees roughly by 2100, which is of course a catastrophic climate change. We know that the impacts by 2 degrees are very difficult to live with for many people on this earth. So, moving on, inside the first global stocktake, based on those findings, the global stocktake, as decided in Dubai last year, calls on parties to transition away from fossil fuels. Maybe it's worth saying that that is the first time the fossil fuels have been mentioned in a UNFCCC decision. Absurd as it is, equally important, we have it there now. And the Global Stocktake also introduced 2 new global goals, one of tripling renewable energy capacity, and the other of doubling the rate of improvement of energy efficiency by 2030. And the Global Stocktake encourages parties to align their NDCs with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, as informed by the latest science, which is important. So, what are the actual implications for the new NDCs, the third generation of NDCs? I will take you through 5 slides with 5 areas that you can draw from the Global Stocktake on what the NDCs should look like, contain, and how they should be developed and implemented. Starting with the 1.5 aligned. Well, they also need to be just, equitable, and based on human rights in their pursuit of 1.5 degrees limit. To achieve that, they need to have absolute targets, sector-specific targets for emissions reductions for 2035, which is the new target year, and of course, developed countries taking the lead. It is crucial that the NDCs outline and describe and explain how they are responding to the GST, including data and the methods they use, any effects it might have on the societies that they are implemented in. For developed countries, the later mid-century for developing countries. And of course, to be 1.5 aligned, there can be no new fossil fuels, no expansion of either production or export of fossil fuels. Specifically looking at the energy package, as it's called, the paragraph 28 from the Global Stocktake decisions, those goals and the transitioning away. The implication is that, like I mentioned, developed countries must take the lead. And of course, it's not only about the targets, but equally much about the implementation. In the current NDCs, we see a slight mismatch of those 2 sides, goals and implementation. So, in order to reach those global goals, there needs to be support for other countries in both developing the NDCs, but more importantly, to implement them, and thereby encouraging countries to set ambitious targets. And one example of how the renewable energy goal translates differently. In large parts of Africa, when you look at the current situation and the projected growth, that would be not 3 times, but a 6-fold increase of existing capacities, which is, of course, an enormous challenge, and that does indeed require support and finance, which, as a side note, this COP is mainly about. One area that doesn't get a lot of attention in the discussions on NDCs is adaptation. The NDCs are, at the core, part of the ambition process of reducing emissions, but adaptation is an as equal part in the Paris Agreement. And in the transformed world that we need to see in order to avoid a catastrophic climate change, adaptation has to be an integral part in all countries, developed and developing. It does, for example, require that the risks and the future changes coming from the climate change that we already know will happen needs to be integrated into all policy processes. And on a more concrete note, the Global Stocktake highlighted the gaps in adaptation finance specifically. And that means that the existing commitment, doubling adaptation finance, has to be filled as quickly as possible, so that those countries who are facing the worst consequences of climate change has the means to deal with it. There is one aspect of the NDCs which is extremely much on the agenda right now, not least today, and that is how they are communicated. This is a political process, and there is a span when the NDCs can be submitted. It started, or is starting now, basically, when their latest should be submitted, and it ends mid-February next year. It is crucial that we see some early NDCs setting the bar at the right level. And countries who are developing such NDCs but cannot submit them yet due to internal political processes, or that they are not fully agreed yet, or there are components missing, can still reveal parts of them, for example, targets. And we've seen just a couple of hours ago the UK doing so in Baku, presenting some pretty good numbers, suggesting emissions reductions by 81%, which is in line with their climate change committee's proposal. There are some unknowns. It's not a full NDC. We'll only see that later. And there are definitely things that need to come in there. But that type of communication is exactly what we need to see. The first third-generation NDC to be submitted came from the United Arab Emirates, who sort of followed their way of implementing the formalities on a level that we are not used to from the UNFCCC process, but on content is lacking. That NDC has some good parts, but the target is not particularly strong, and there, more importantly, maybe, considering the nature of the country's economy, there are no commitments to end new fossil fuel production or even phasing it out properly. Brazil has revealed some parts of their NDC. We're waiting for the details. That also seems to be a pretty mixed bag of what they're proposing. But we're awaiting, in this week and in next week, more signals coming from political leaders, ministers, and others on countries' NDCs that we can expect to see. Lastly, of the 5 points, it's about partnerships. And this is where we are both looking at the development of new NDCs, but maybe even more so to the implementation of them. There is a lot to gain by forming partnerships. The climate crisis cannot be tackled by individual countries. And of course, we have the global north and south differences. And partnerships based on sort of equal standing are a key tool in achieving NDCs that correspond to the Global Stocktake. they certainly need to include all the stakeholders that are relevant. And here, serving as kind of a bridge to the next part of this event, the participation of civil society is, of course, incredibly important. Maybe in particular from developing countries, where some other structures, in some cases, are not as strong. And I am very interested to hear what the rest of this event will present in that area. And by that, I leave you with my contact details and look forward to seeing, hopefully, some of you in Baku next week.
Okay. Thank you so much, Petter. I think that was an amazing start to our conversation, and we are looking forward to seeing you here next week. So next, as you can see, I have 4 chairs with me, and I'm so excited to introduce an amazing set of panelists to the stage. So first, I would like to ask Elisa Özbek to join me up here. Elisa is the Deputy Head of the Section for International Climate Policy at the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, where she, among other things, works on NDC diplomacy. So thank you so much for joining us today, Elisa. Next up, I have Anna Boroshenko, who is the climate advocacy, who brought her own fan club, and also is the climate advocacy coordinator at the Climate Action Network for Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. So she will give us some insights from the region today. Thank you so much, Anna. And thirdly, we have Fernanda Carvalho, who is the Global Climate Policy Coordinator at WWF and also coordinates the Climate Action Network Ambition Group. Thank you for joining us, Fernanda. And then I need to take, you're there, okay. Our 4th speaker is straight off the plane, so please give her an extra big applause for coming here 5 minutes after she checked in. It's Chiharani. She's a researcher for the Indonesian Center for Environmental Law, where she works on climate energy advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, so we just got a really good overview from Petter, what has happened and what is about to happen in the next 2 weeks. And I would love to start us off in the first round of questions, looking at how we can ensure that the next round of NDCs actually does ramp up ambition as it's so urgently needed. And also what we need in order to ensure that it also delivers on climate justice. Just as a reminder, the year 2024 is once again on track to being the hottest year on record. And the recent UNEP emissions gap report says we need to urgently to step up both ambition, but also especially implementation. So there's quite some work ahead. I think the most recent floods in Nepal, Nigeria, and Spain, and in so many other parts of the world underlined why this work is so important and why it touches on the actual lived realities of so many people. I would love to start this round with Anna, since we're kind of on your home turf. So this year's COP is in the ICA region, and you're working very closely with many different NGOs from the different countries. And I wanted to ask you, looking ahead at the next 2 weeks, what are the key aspects that need to be achieved when it comes to the NDCs, and what are the expectations of civil society from this region when it comes to this COP and also this presidency?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for inviting me here today. And as we come together here for COP29, I believe we are together at the very crucial point of our shared journey. We are here not just to talk about climate goals or commitments. We are here to secure our sustainable future, the things we cherish, and also the opportunity to create and to live in the world where everyone has opportunity to thrive. And the next 2 weeks are very, very important. We must leave this COP with a renewed sense of commitment to closing 1.5 gap, and also with commitment to acting with the urgency that both justice and science require. And in Climate Action Network, ECA, we believe that climate justice cannot be without protecting human rights and civil society freedoms. Unfortunately, both of them are under threat in our region, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And while these countries are diverse and not uniformed, all of them face the similar challenges. And these challenges are often tied to fossil fuels, the rise of nuclear energy in our region, and also with the rise of authoritarian ambitions. And all this leads to our civil society shrinking space. And all this happens while we as humanity face an urgent task to close the 1.5 gap and secure a livable future. The Global Stocktake outcomes and the latest IPCC science show that the window to address this challenge is closing fast. And one of the most powerful tools we have to drive these ambitions is NDCs. And to truly fulfill our commitment to climate neutrality, countries must approach NDCs with a resumed sense of urgency and inclusivity. This means creating NDCs that reflect not only climate goals, but also social needs and realities, economic needs, and aspirations and needs of all groups of people, and especially marginalized groups. And the presidency plays a crucial role in this process. First, by championing the principle that no NDC is developed in isolation from the people it impacts. Effective climate solutions require us to listen, to engage with civil society, and to understand the needs of marginalized communities, and to ensure that voices shape our climate policies. Without this, our policies risk becoming or will continue to be just top-down mandates disconnected from the realities on the ground. And in this spirit, the presidency must encourage parties to embrace inclusive NDC development processes. Article 12 of Paris Agreement calls for public participation and access to information. It's called for every delegation, for every government to reach out, to consult, to communicate with civil society. And it isn't about just checking box. It's about building NDCs that are resilient, just, and truly responsive to communities they serve. Civil society is a vital partner in this effort, and they monitor NDC implementation, hold governments accountable. They bring forward the perspectives of those often unheard. And for civil society's role to be meaningful, they need access to information and opportunities to input. Here, the presidency can set an example of ensuring diverse and accessible channels for public engagement, social media for youth, radio for rural areas, and maybe printed materials for areas with limited access to internet. We must reach everyone, not just those who are already in this room. And beyond information sharing, the presidency should promote the creation of dedicated platforms of civil society engagement in NDC development. Where such platform exists, They should support and empower direct policy influence. And this ensures that NDCs aren't just plans, and NDCs might be national documents, but their impact is local. It impacts health, transportation, agriculture, and countless other areas. And as we look toward the NDC revisions, the presidency must keep ambition front and center. We need strong, inclusive, and robust NDCs that prioritize climate resilience, justice, and sustainability. This is our collective responsibility not only to meet our climate goals, but to ensure that those most vulnerable to climate impacts are protected and empowered. With a strong commitment to civil society inclusion and unwavering dedication to ambition, I am sure we can make this COP a turning point toward our resilient and just future. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Anna. I think you also already hinted at some points we are going to discuss in the second round of questions. Moving away a bit from the regional perspective, I would like to ask Fernanda, because you are coordinating the CAN Ambition Working Group, and last summer you published quite a broad guideline on what NDCs 3.0 should look like and what they should entail, maybe also what parts they should cover. So could you give us an overview of the key elements that we need in order to ensure that the next round of NDCs actually does deliver on the GST?
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is feeling fine and excited and not like me, that, it's not that I'm not feeling fine and excited, but, those 2 days have been like 2 weeks. When a COP starts, you just get very, very tired, dragged into things, many conversations already happening. But I want to explain why our guidance is so comprehensive in the first place. I think that the vision from CAN International is that NDCs are more than a mitigation target. They are much more than a number. They are comprehensive plans that should foster 1.5 alignment and climate justice. We think, 1.5 alignment is a mitigation measure and it's central to NDCs. Of course, you should have good numbers, good pledges to reduce emissions, but that's not what all about NDCs. We should also foster climate justice. And based on this vision, we have developed this paper, which is NDC Guidelines for NDCs 3.0, delivering on the GST and beyond. Because the GST is, of course, the roadmap to have good NDCs in this first round, but there are things that we wanted to have considered in the GST that didn't make it to the GST. And we still think they should be part of NDCs. So the first point is responding to the Global Stocktake, this roadmap, this exercise where countries got together to analyze where we are, where we need to be, and how to get there, that Peter has already explained, so I don't need to dwell on that. But how do we know that we are responding to the GST outcomes and beyond? First of all, the GST recommended economy-wide absolute emission reduction targets. So that's what we want to see in NDCs. Sectoral objectives, the GST covered various sectors, and the key one is the energy sector that we are finally talking about and discussing after 30 years of the UNFCCC plus the Paris Agreement. So we really need to deliver a fossil fuel phase-out, transitioning away from fossil fuels, whatever is your favorite language. That's the paragraph 28 and etc. And also tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. Not only those, but also conserving ecosystems, halting and reversing deforestation, circular economy, methane targets, and transforming agriculture systems. I think everyone that followed the GST has those paragraphs and those sectors in their mind. I think transparency and tracking progress is also one of the elements on responding to the GST outcomes and beyond. We want to read in this new round of NDCs how the countries are responding to the GST and beyond. So that's the pillar on responding to the GST and beyond. The second pillar that's key for us is reflecting equity through fair shares. So from developing countries, we want to see their needs, of course, and what they are able to do with their own resources and what kind of support is needed. And from developed countries, we want to see what kind of support they can provide. That's what we understand as equity and fair shares. Solidarity and justice is another pillar. And under this, there are aspects such as adaptation and loss and damage, just transition, addressing development challenges, SDGs, a rights-based approach, that's very, very important, and inclusiveness and participation. So that's the other side of the NDC. That's not going to say this is aligned to 1.5 or not, but that's how you deliver on climate justice, and for us, this is equally important. We also think that NDCs should contemplate adequate finance to respond to needs. So once developing countries, state their needs, that should be met by developed countries, and the finance that they are willing to deploy. According to their obligations under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And that's why in this COP, the discussions are all very connected. There isn't a single track of discussion. Finance is going to be present in every room, not only in the NCQG discussions. It's also very present in the discussions on the UAE dialogue, which is the process to follow up on the GST. So yeah, this is going to be very, very important. And it's a make or break moment because, whatever we decide here, it's going to define whether we are going to have the NDCs that we need for the next year. So I think it's also very important to state that of course, we want NDC from all countries, and a lot of people are saying the UAE is the first to come up with an NDC, and I think that's sad because in 2024, Namibia, Panama, and Madagascar also put out updates on their NDCs. So we need to recognize those countries too, and we want, NDCs from all countries. But the NDCs that are going to turn the dial are the G20 NDCs, because those countries represent 80% of global emissions and 80% of the global GDP. When we do this exercise of assessing if NDCs are 1.5 aligned, it's also a needed exercise, but if we have like 4 or 5 NDCs that are 1.5 aligned, what does that do to 1.5 globally? 1.5 is a collective measure. So I would like to finish my intervention now, reminding everyone in this room that we need to tackle this problem together. Only collective action will sort the climate issues. So that will be my contribution for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. I think that's always a very important reminder, especially at the start of COP, to kind of gather some collective momentum. So for our third civil society perspective, I would like to invite you, Shaharani, to maybe zoom back in a bit, because you developed together with a broad alliance of NGOs from Indonesia your own demands for the Indonesian NDC. And I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit about especially the aspect of climate justice, which is such an important but also a very broad term, how you would like for it to be included in the NDC in order to turn it into something tangible and something that isn't just a concept or statement, but something that can be felt in people's real lives. So the stage is yours.
Okay, hi, thank you. I hope I'm audible enough. Thank you for inviting me to speak in this panel. I'm very excited to share about what we have been doing, and as maybe as a context, Indonesia is currently revising their NDC. So it's planned that they're going to release probably soon, so their second NDC. But another context is why in the end ISEL and also a lot of civil society in Indonesia collaborate and also really want to kind of like put an intervention on the progress of NDC development is because Indonesia is, I can say Indonesia is a bit unique. We have many sectors and also points intersecting with each other. For example, Indonesia is known for their coal production and also coal use in energy sector, but also at the same time, they're also known as one of the sources, big emitter from forest and land use. And when we are talking about climate, mitigating climate and also adapting to climate is, in the end, it's not going to be that simple as, you know, changing your energy to cleaner energy or like as simple as like protecting your forest, because in reality, this these mitigation actions, these adaptation actions actually interlink with many kinds of many people, many vulnerable groups that are heavily impacted by those mitigation and adaptation actions. So that's why the notion of climate justice is very important to be discussed. So in the recommendation, we kind of like frame what kind of climate justice that we would like to envision and for it to be integrated in Indonesia's NDC. So the first is, I think almost all of us in Indonesia kind of like agree that one of the core and root cause of climate change is also the unequal distribution of resources and access to wealth, resources. And in Indonesia it's very apparent because a lot of major companies, a lot of people who are in more powerful economical standing, they own a very huge access to natural resources, building business on natural resources, while those living very nearby in the vicinity of those natural resources are often the poorest in Indonesia. So this inequality is also one thing that we would like to address, because in our vision, there will be no climate justice without social and economic justice. So that's the first thing that we kind of like envision when we talk about climate change. And then next we also discuss about equal resource benefit and risk distribution among groups. So we don't want that the poorest bear all the brunt of climate change and also the risk of those mitigation actions. As you see, while transitioning to cleaner energy and also, for example, electric vehicle, we see a lot of communities are also suffering on the ground because of the critical mineral extractive industries that are kind of trying to push them from their homeland, etc. So that's the reality that should be taken into consideration. And then, of course, the informed and meaningful participation. And lastly is restoring people's rights and also repairing the harm that has been caused by especially the fossil fuel industry in Indonesia. We see in Indonesia, we have a lot of mining, unrehabilitated mining that has taken a lot of lives near the coal mining, and those are those restoration or environmental restoration are something that has never been discussed prior. Even when we talk about just transition in Indonesia, we don't really talk about restoring the environment that has been destroyed by fossil fuel industry. So in our NDC recommendation, we kind of like highlight that point to not only move towards a more sustainable future, but we also think about the legacy impact that has been left unaddressed for so many years. I think that's what we envision.
Thank you so much. So to finish off the last round, Elisa, we've just heard quite a few different civil society perspectives, and I think one thing that has been stressed is the special importance of G20 NDCs, which of course would include the EU NDC, which Germany is a part of. So from a government perspective, what would you say were the learnings from the last round of NDCs, and how would you build onto those to ensure that the next NDCs does actually deliver on all the points that were already raised on the panel today?
Hello, yeah, perfect. Thank you for the question, and it's great to be here on the panel, and really happy also to sit on a panel in the German Pavilion and to have the possibility to talk about such an important topic. And indeed, there are many lessons which all of you already, to a certain extent, addressed. And maybe I'm going to talk a bit about where Europe is standing, or where the EU NDC is standing, what we think we have learned over the past cycle, and what we believe is really important from a German perspective to take forward with regard to our EU NDC development, but then of course beyond, what do we need on an international level going into 2025 and at COP30. First of all, as you all know, Germany and the EU have set quite clear targets. And I think that's maybe one of the first lessons I just want to underline. NDCs, which are, we believe, embedded in long-term strategies, are more effective. Because I think it is very important to have then interim targets. And we more or less set them in the EU with the EU Green Deal, 2030 minus 55%, 2050 net zero. Germany actually has a additional, or like a net zero target on its own, which is 2045. And I think, given that Germany is the biggest economy within Europe, the German target of 2045, of course, also positively influenced, I would say, the level of EU ambition. And with the Fit for 55 package, it's a package of a lot of different instruments and measures to reduce emissions across sectors. I think we are, if fully implemented for 2030, on a quite good way ahead. But I think one thing which we've learned also with the view ahead, and we are discussing, like the 2040 target, we are discussing, like the 2035 NDC, and I'm very happy to talk about this as well. An NDC is a living document. It is not static. So I think, while I fully agree with every 5 years there have to be a submission, and every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, every party or parties are asked to raise the ambition, and that's very, very important, in particular when we are going into next year. I think throughout those 5 years, we have to acknowledge that essentially NDCs and policy developments and instruments which we are implement are going on. And that I find for governments, for societies, for economies of great importance, that everybody is understanding that this is an evolving process, and that more ambition is at any time possible. And I think going into the next cycle, we have a better understanding also of the challenges. And yes, I'm going to be very clear here. We need sound modeling, and we need all sectors. And I think the EU impact assessment, I don't know who has read it, it came out on the 6th of February this year, comprises 600 pages and more or less shows the pathways based on science. How do we get, to net zero in 2050 and 1.5 alignment, or to contribute as EU to 1.5 alignment, because as was said by Fernanda, this is a global or collective effort, and this is very important. That of course not only the EU, but in particular the G20, but all parties come forward with 1.5 aligned NDCs. But I also wanted to touch upon what you said, climate justice, because that's also a lesson we have, I think, learned in Europe, and I think which is really important going forward. I think the social dimension of the transformation, the social dimension, the justice aspects of a just transition, and like how this is going to have an impact on the whole of society and whole of the economy and lots of different parts of civil society. I think this is very important, and this is a joint learning experience as well. So I find this is also very important to hear from you and from others, because as we transition, there are more challenges or new challenges coming our way, which we need to address, and we need to address them, like with the right policies. Lastly, I just want to mention that I believe it is of great, great importance that this COP sends out very clear signals with regard to the next round of NDCs. We got really good guidance from the GST, what should be there in NDCs with regard to absolute emission reduction targets and everything which Fernanda has mentioned. But those NDCs are still being developed and they have to be presented, like next year, because we have set ourselves a clear target also for COP30. And that clear target is, like that we go down further, like on 1.5 alignment. So your like voice and also the work, like which is being done in every country and here at the global level, it is really important that we are sending those signals also from COP29. This is not only a finance COP. Yes, finance is very important as well, but it is also really important that we are sending the right signals and this joint lesson learned with regard to the NDCs. And all of you know there are NDC features being discussed as well, which is very technical in nature, but it is very important in substance. And we very much hope that, of course, those negotiations are going to be concluded successfully. I leave it there, looking forward to further questions.
Thank you so much, Elisa. And I'm sure there are quite a lot of burning questions from the audience, but actually I wanted to first touch on the second area we're discussing today. So maybe put a pin on all the things that you want to ask our speakers later. Because the second big question we wanted to discuss today is how civil society can meaningfully be involved in the NDC process. So I think you already raised some really important points on bottom-up approaches, on aspects of justice. And I think one thing that I also always like to stress is how participation is such a central question of justice, but it's actually also something that ensures better policy in the end, because it enhances transparency and acceptance, and I think it grounds policies in the local conditions. So speaking of civil society participation, Anna, I think the ECA region has been maybe a bit more in the news than usually during the past years, sadly often for very sad reasons. So there is still a war going on. We've seen restrictions of civil society through processes like the foreign agent law in Georgia, for example. So could you maybe give us an impression what challenges civil society from your different countries faces at the moment, and also whether you have some good practices that you have found useful to overcome these challenges and actually participate in climate policy?
Yeah, indeed, as you said, civil society in the ECA region has faced increased attention, especially since Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine and protests against foreign influence law. Yet, even before these events, the region has been under constant pressure, with civil society operating in the environment with really little stability or freedom. 12 years ago, Russia pioneered restrictions in our region on civil society by passing foreign agents law, targeting NGOs that are receiving foreign funds for political activities. Climate and environmental activities are political activities. Since then, other countries in the region, including Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, and most recently Georgia, have adopted similar laws, often with little or no change in wording. And these restrictions have spread across the region, and with them, civil society space has continued to shrink. And as I said before, the shrinking space of civil society in our region is the greatest challenge we face. As authoritarianism grows in the ICA region, democratic freedoms are increasingly curtailed. And these trends, especially during climate crisis, is very dangerous. Effective climate action and public engagement in its efforts can only happen in within the framework of strong democratic institutions. And without democracy, we cannot expect an active, engaged civil society to hold governments accountable or to push for policies that reflect the needs of communities. Civil society is, in fact, one of the few democratic forces left in the region, and it's essential to push the push for climate action, providing monitoring, advocacy, and also this momentum of transition away from fossil fuels for renewable energy. And without civil society's involvement, climate action in our region will remain weak. And governments alone, they are not really willing to prioritize climate funding. Adding to these challenges is highly centralized structure of most states in our region, which limits effective feedback on climate policies. Only Ukraine in our region has a decentralized government allowing for a shorter and more responsive path between community needs and governmental actions. And these structures enables more direct link within community requests and policy formulation and back to local implementation. And in contrast, other countries in the region with their top-down approaches often lack the necessary access to information and data to develop feedback and response to new policies. And even when they do have this access, implementing climate action on the ground is an uphill battle, as power remains concentrated in the central level. Our communities are already struggling because of the climate crisis, with Central Asia recognized as a hotspot of global warming. And despite this, our governments continue to invest billions in fossil fuels, worsening the crisis. 6 countries in our regions are among top 25 in the world, with the highest share of GDP spent on fossil fuel subsidies. Meanwhile, Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine has highlighted a stark contrast in global priorities. Since the start of full-scale invasion in 2022, countries worldwide spent 800 billion on Russian gas, oil, coal, fueling Russia's federal budget, which in turn funds the bloody war and expands Russian influence in the region. And yet, developed countries have still failed to deliver 100 billion annual commitment to support climate adaptation and resilience in the least developed countries. This stark disparity sends a clear message about priorities of governments in the world. Without civil society, who will hold them accountable? who will ensure that promises are met. And turning back to the challenges faced by civil society organizations in our region, how can we overcome them? Activists across ICA region rely heavily on international partnerships and funding to overcome these challenges and continue their work. As Can ICA, we call on Western institutions to create flexible funding opportunities and mechanism to ensure that NGOs here and activists are not left in isolation with authoritarian regimes. International support is not just helpful, it is essential for us. And without it, any progress on climate actions here will be at risk. Governments will continue their reliance on fossil fuels, they will continue their subsidies here, activists will face greater isolation and repression, and climate crisis in our region and globally will escalate. So in summary, civil society in the ICA region is crucial for both democratic and climate action, and it needs our collective support to overcome it. And also, I would like to ask you if you're interested more in the state of play of climate policies in our region. My colleagues and we can share with you some materials. We made climate policy overview with the latest updates of the region. Yeah, please feel free to learn more about ICA region. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And I saw that there are actually quite a few of the colleagues from the ICA region here, so maybe that's a good chance to chat a bit after our talk. After we've heard from the ICA region, Shaharani, do you maybe want to share some of the insights that civil society in Southeast Asia is facing at the moment, and whether you have any good practice examples of things that have worked for you to actually ensure that civic space remains open?
Yeah, I think I would like to echo the point that ensuring civil society participation by guaranteeing freedom of civic space is the prerequisite for to ensure that our highest ambition is grounded in human rights and justice. I think when we're talking about collaborative action, both in international, regional, and national level, it also means that providing spaces for exchanges of experiences and knowledge on how we can do better in, increasing our ambition and in doing our sprint for closing the gap to 1.5. But I think what's the most important point, especially for Southeast Asian context, to summarize, I think why the role of civil society become very important is because we have a lot of local solutions, best practices that have been conducted by, for example, in mitigation, we have many indigenous people and local communities that have been conducting forest conservation for hundreds of years. They are very familiar with it. They live together in harmony with nature and have been developing this very unique approach in conserving nature. And also in adaptation, a lot of local communities have been cultivating new kind of rice pellets that can adapt to extreme weather that Indonesia is facing right now due to climate change. These experiences are often undocumented, so the only way we know how and we know about these best practices and how we can integrate that into the NDCs is by conducting public participation, in which the civil society facilitates those exchange between policymakers and also the local community that they have been assisting for so many years. I think that's the experience in Southeast Asia. By opening this channel for public participation, we really make sure that our NDC is adopting these best practices and also catering to local and grassroots communities' aspiration and needs. Because sometimes with the top-down approach, the NDC become very technical, very theoretically, and often it doesn't work on the ground. So providing these exchanges, collaborative and co-ownership with the community and civil society in developing and also implementing the NDC is very important to address those implementation gap that we always see in every NDC updates, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much for adding these points. I think it's so interesting to hear about how civil society is, on the one hand, so important for climate action, but also how it's actually such a rich resource for solutions that are already happening on the ground. Now, Elisa, we heard quite a few points raised about the interconnection between climate change action and democracy, how both topics are very closely interlinked and how one is so important for the other. And I know that this discussion is also very much at the forefront of the minds of many people at home in Germany at the moment. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think governments or like political institutions can do in order to ensure that civil society participation happens in a meaningful way and to ensure that civic space remains open?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you once more to my pre-speakers. Very important points you both raised, and I think in general, of course, having an open government, having consultation processes in the development of, or like first of all, having a civil society and having, so to speak, the possibility of freedom of opinion, freedom of speech, but in addition, like science, because of course this is also very important to our process and knowledge. I think that's incredibly important. To us, and I just wanted to say that again, the role of civil society is really to give input, but also to be a watchdog and to give us some correcting action, like if we need so, because it's not only about the development of policies or climate policies, it's really also about the implementation, because you said it, like where does implementation happen? It's on the local level, and usually, like it does affect people. If, in particular, like when there is a big energy transition, like going on. But of course, also, like if there is a climate crisis accelerating, and I think it is of great importance that there's space for it created, and that political institutions, like have the mechanisms in place to allow that. And given that I'm from the Foreign Office, I'm going to maybe say a couple of words what we are doing in our foreign policy to more or less also ensure that we have a climate foreign diplomacy and climate foreign policy, which is more or less supporting that approach. So Germany adopted actually last year on the 6th of December its first climate foreign policy, which is a whole of government document and strategy. And to date, we have like 57 embassies across the globe, which have been labeled climate embassies. And they're obviously really reporting on, let's say, climate policies in Indonesia, but they're also engaging with climate civil society, and also with the private sector in third countries to drive forward the transformation and to also support spaces. Like, for instance, we are organizing climate talks which is usually a project, like which is then implemented by a civil society organization, but supported by the German embassy, in order to bring together also scientists, private sector, civil society. We do that at home, and we really think that this is a very important mechanism, and we have been doing so as well with regard to the next round of NDCs, and we will continue to do so, and kind of like have the feeling that's very important to go forward. I leave it there, and I'm looking forward to also maybe some questions from the crowd.
Thank you very much. So Fernanda, to close off the second round of questions, we've just heard some local perspectives, some national perspectives, some regional perspectives, but we are going to spend the next 2 weeks in this space, so in the international space. And since you've been working so much with different stakeholders, I wanted to ask you, how do you think civil society, maybe first, what's the state of civil society participation within the UNFCCC process and within this space? And how do you think it could be improved upon?
Well, I want to speak from my experience. I've been going to COPs and participating for, I would say, about 15, almost 20 years. It's not that I'm old, but I've been doing that, before it was cool, as I would say, I think it's very important that people come to COPs and are able to attend sessions. Access is of the essence. So badging, we had a different badging experience this year where badges were reduced to some sort of organizations to allow for broader participation of the Global South. I think it was made with good intentions, but for example, for global organizations that have Global South offices, that kind of reduced the access. So I think it's also a learning exercise by the UNFCCC how to allow participation. I think the participation of constituencies is something that we are constantly learning about. The Climate Action Network, as you saw here, it's a case study. I mean, from an academic perspective, I am a PhD in international relations, and there are lots of theses and articles written about this organization of NGOs. It's more than 1,000 NGOs. I think it's 1,200 now with global presence, participating, come together. So listen to us. We are here, we have our perspectives, we have technical diverse background. We engage with lots of stakeholders like indigenous peoples, etc. But I also want to talk a little bit about participation, for example, in the NDC processes, because I think that, it's one thing to have the participation of civil society and civil society coming together once a year, but this is something that should go on throughout the year and also in implementation processes. So when we are talking about NDC development, I mean, we have the experience of WWF that we did an analysis of the previous NDCs in 2021. Before it was cool, now everyone is analyzing NDCs. And we put out a checklist, and for inclusiveness and participation, we talk about inclusive processes to invite inputs from institutions and citizens in the NDC processes. And that could be also for, positions in the UNFCCC. Brazil, for example, discusses with civil society what they're going to present, in the UNFCCC, and could also have discussions in the NDC processes. But, the experience from Latin America, that is very good in consultation processes and etc. I would say there are good and there are bad examples. This could be just a box-ticking exercise. I did a consultation, fine, and I heard you, but then I put out something completely different. Well, how to avoid that? Disclosure of information is key. So sharing materials, sharing drafts, that's how you allow for meaningful participation, both at the national and the global level. Reporting back on inputs, it's not like, we did a consultation, thank you, and now we put out something completely different and don't even explain you why. So having platforms and responding to the inputs. I mean, of course, you don't have to take on all the inputs, but at least have a dialogue. I think that's important. And of course, having whole of government, Elisa mentioned the whole of government and how Germany is doing. I think that's a good example. And whole of society, climate governance structures is key. Not only the UNFCCC, but regional governance structures at the national level, so we can also focus on implementation. Because I think this regime is not just about, rule making and this phase we are in. I think what's going to rebuild trust and really make the regime deliver in this next phase of NDCs is implementation. So I think that's very, very important. And I would say that at the national and the regional level, international cooperation has been key, for participatory processes. Processes where GIZ was involved in building capacities, not only GIZ, but UNDP, UNEP, so international cooperation as a whole has a role to play. So yeah, that's not a whole, it's a role, sorry. It's my English failing me as I'm already tired. And I think that's also very interesting. I think that, building the capacity of civil society to engage in those processes is also really, really important. And as I've been around for a while, it's very rewarding to me to see how the learning curve has increased, how many people understand those processes and, can be peers and discuss with countries like peers. So I think we are in a good moment, but we need to acknowledge that, there is this shrinking civil society space, but I think that I mentioned here many examples, many measures that can, avoid this from happening and counteracting this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are good in time. Thank you for that. I don't think it's a given. So we do have some space for questions from the audience, and I've been invited to take part in the little experiment, which is called a throwing microphone. I don't know whether you've heard of it. I can see some skeptical looks. So basically it just means that our microphone is quite plushy today, and you can just speak into it like this. That also means if you have a drink in your hand, maybe put it down or something else that's breakable. Otherwise, are there any questions from the audience for our 4 amazing panelists today? Okay, so we have 1, 2. Hold on, we'll give it the first try.
Ready? Is it working? Okay. Yeah. Thank you for all the insightful comments from panelists. And then I'm Jihan from Solutions for Our Climate Advocacy based in Seoul, South Korea. And let me start with my question with good news from South Korea. Recently, we had historic winning from constitutional courts, which ruled that current Korean climate goal is unlawful in terms of not specifying its plans after 2031 to achieve 2050 net zero. And it's largely influenced by German ruling Neubauer. So thank you. And my question is that, so after this ruling, large discussions on NDC is going on all around Korea. And as a CSO, we are facing some gaps. Scientists are based on modeling. They are suggesting less ambitious target for the next NDC target. However, lawyers who's involved in the ruling I mentioned are suggesting fair share based number. It's more ambitious. So as a CSO, I think that might be relevant to Elisa or Fernanda and all panels. So could you give us some advice to proper position as a CSO who is facing those gaps, who are working closely with the scientists and other CSOs more insisting fair share numbers?
Okay, could you pass the mic on to the next speaker who was in the back row?
Okay.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I learned a lot from the panelists. My name is Daniel Wei. My institution is part of Friends of the Eye International. I'm from Liberia. I work for Sustainable Development Institute. Liberia is in Africa, and from the experience shared, I didn't hear anything about Africa, particularly a country like Liberia that's emerging from years of war. And as part of the investment, the previous government gave huge portion of our land to investment. And some of the effects of the processes are experiences that we didn't used to get from the investment now. We getting the impact of climate change. That is, in terms of food production, the quantity of food and the quality have diminished. In terms of rainfall, it has changed. And so some of the cities and towns that didn't used to experience huge amount of rainfall are getting it. And the common people, the traditional people, are being affected. So, and some of the companies that are doing the investment are from Asia and some part of Europe, particularly around Malaysia, that is hugely involved into agriculture, palm farming. So what you, civil society from around Malaysia, Indonesia, what are you doing to ensure that your government or the company, the companies that operate in the country have the lessons that you educating them so they can pass on to countries like Liberia where they do the investment? And the DAI spoke about issue of capacity building. You know, the NDC is a new approach, because even in our country where the issues around information sharing is a bit lacking by government, it was even this year that I personally participated in event to discuss issues around the NDC. What is your institution doing to ensure that what you're doing in Europe and Asia reflect in Africa, so that civil society in Africa can also have the capacity to participate in the kind of environment, in the kind of discussions, and share experience, so we globally fight the issues around climate change? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the first two speakers. Maybe you can take a hold of it for a second, and then if there's another question, we'll pass it on. But no maybe problem. We can answer these first two questions. So there was one from the colleague from Korea about how to close the gap between modeling that suggests a low amount and fair share approaches. And then the question from the colleague from Liberia, which I guess was targeted towards you, Sharani. Does anyone of you want to comment on the first question?
Yeah, I can comment on the first question. So I think it's great that you had a legal win. I see that, you know, judicialization or processes in climate, they're becoming important everywhere in the world. Brazilian civil society, and you know, my role is global, but I'm a Brazilian citizen, so I saw that happen in Brazil too. Youth sued the Brazilian government for not complying with their NDC, and they also got a win. That happened in Mexico, that happened in Germany. We have multiple examples. And even more recently, we have the ICJ working to issue, an opinion, an advisory opinion on climate change. So that's important, and that shows how important the issue is. Regarding fair shares, I think there are various approaches. We, civil society, produce a civil society equity review every year. So looking at this report and the facts it brings and being able to discuss that with scientists, I think that our guidelines are a good input for that, because we're talking about not only 1.5 alignment and science, but also the enabling conditions for that, and under the umbrella of climate justice. That's what you need to have in place to get the numbers that you need. So I think that, turning this conversation around and bringing those elements and trying to discuss them with science can make the difference. That would be my advice for you, and congratulations on the effort in South Korea.
Are you ready for the second question?
Great. Yes, thank you. I would also like to touch upon the first one. As a fellow lawyer, I actually understand where you're coming from. First, congratulations on the huge success of the case. But also maybe coming from my experience as a lawyer as well, I know how difficult it is to have a communication with people coming from science background, because we have like two totally different approaches. But I think this is where those spaces really becomes important, because and also of course the capacity building for NGO becomes important. Modeling is a bunch of assumptions that are made to produce result, right? So I think coming from a law background, I think as lawyers, we need to understand what are those assumptions. What are they thinking about when they kind of like projecting this model and result? So this is where the capacity building comes in order for a broader civil society can actually understand and process those data and contribute actively and meaningfully into the substance. I think bridging those gaps is very important. So we as coming from, social science lawyer, that of course we want that rule of law to apply in the case of NDC, right? We can communicate what are the factors, the standards, indicators that we would like to see in your models. And they can also trying to understand our point of view. So finding the common ground and speaking in the same similar language that both can understand, I think it's important to bridge those gaps between law and also science, because it also happens in policy making, of course, where these two fields are sometimes not in line because of very different approaches. I think coming from my experience, those engagement and capacity building for CSO to build that, bridge that knowledge is very important. As for the second question, I think it's also coming to our second part discussion earlier, where having a safe civic space become a catalyst for civil society to actually monitor the implementation and the progress that the government has made to respond to climate threats. In Indonesia, for example, problems around food security sometimes also clash with the need for us to conserve forests, and also to ensure that those communities, local communities, depending on the nature, is also doesn't have their livelihood threatened by projects that are aimed to secure food security, for example. So this is where the safe space for civil society to collaborate with the government and to monitor the progress comes in. Because from what I've seen in Indonesia, for example, a lot of more viable and locally rooted solutions are there, but sometimes they're not just documented and heard by the policymakers. So these alternatives, from what maybe what the policymakers think as like a sole solutions need to be brought up into the surfaces, and civil society can become the actors that bridge those missing narratives and those alternatives to come forward into the surface and being considered in the process. And also with civil society closely monitoring, of course, it will also kind of like building the trust and also accountability in the process. Our actions to ensure one thing doesn't hamper another thing, including other people's livelihood in the process. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, can I maybe make just one additional comment, because I think you brought something up which is, I find also really important just to mention, which is the peace, security and climate nexus and how this is interlinking and interacting. And I just want to underline, Germany is putting quite an important emphasis on this, part of our climate foreign policy. And I think the question in particular, how to do climate action, while at the same time adapting, while at the same time coming out, of maybe a war, maybe while still experiencing conflict which may be aggravated because of the climate crisis. I think that is very important to address. And my minister, she was recently also at the Berlin Climate Security Conference underlining that, and I think it is just important to mention as well, I mean, food security, but also questions of people having a home. I mean, this is of course something, we really need to look at. And I'm in a 2-degree world, we will have more than 200 million people which have to essentially leave their current homes. In a 4-degree world, it's going to be up to almost 2 billion. And I think this is, obviously showing the urgency. And I think it's very important that you brought up as well those interlinkages, which need to be addressed as well. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Elisa, for this last comment, which I think really underlined an important aspect. So unfortunately, we have already come to the end of our time today. So I just wanted to once again thank my amazing panelists for today. Maybe if you still have questions, you can either grab them after the event, or if they have to run off, your details are on the website. I think a huge thank you to the team of the German Pavilion, who behind the scenes are working very, very hard to make all of this happen. I think it's work that often stays invisible. And lastly, thank you to all of you for coming today. I hope each of you can take away 1 or 2 ideas that might inspire your work in the next 2 weeks and for all the time after that to come. And I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.